This is Monica Perez here with part 5 of our series where we read and discuss the book, The Octopus, Secret Government and the Death of Danny Casolaro. This is a revised edition by Kenn Thomas and Jim Keith. If you want to start at the beginning, I uploaded the first episode, part 1, on June 20th, 2024 in the Monica Perez Show feed. So now on with the book. It's so juicy. It's such a slim volume, but man, is it packed with, I would say, dangerous facts. We're up to chapter 13, The Octopus. Danny Casolaro never lived to tell the full story of the octopus. He left us with only drafts and notes for his proposed project. Nonetheless, the story he was outlining is compelling and credible. Here are Casolaro's notes on his octopus. This is the story of 8 men whose real-life, impossible mission intrigues have dominated key events that span the globe for nearly a half-century. They are the men who make up the octopus. See, I thought the octopus, I thought that was a device imposed later by others, that the octopus was 8 men, but I guess it was 8 men. But I mean, really, it's about tentacles that reach around the globe, but just 8? Hard to believe. They are not government officials. I thought some of them were. I guess what he's saying is the government officials and stuff are maybe the little suckers, the suckers on the tentacles. They are not government officials, but their tentacles can reach into any part of government in almost any country, including legitimate and rogue spy networks. They are not notable industrialists, but they can pull the strings of the oil and banking empires at will. They are not known criminals, but they have successfully penetrated all factions of organized crime, including the mafia, the Japanese yakuza, the secret Chinese triads, and the terrorist underground. Is he going to name these 8 people? Are these the they trademark that we always talk about? I mean, I read this book once a long time ago, but it might have been before the scales were fully off my eyes, so I didn't realize how explosive it was. With its tag team compartments, its exploitation of hundreds of people, and formidable stealth, the octopus will help to unravel the most compelling puzzles of the 20th century. What may have begun for these few learned men as a utopian response to harsh post-war realities quickly gave way to what simple men have always known as the real enemy, which is selfishness and its allied forces of fear, greed, and power. Maybe he never read the secret origins of World War I, but I would say this, whatever powers that be, are not a response to the wars, but maybe, I mean, unless there was a changing of the guard, but I don't think so, because the people who instituted those wars benefited from them, and I believe survived. While a few of these 8 men came together to ensure the failure of an initiative in Albania in the 50s, almost every one of them helped to frustrate the Cuban Bay of Pigs invasion. What did the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs accomplish? President Nixon and Attorney General John Mitchell were becoming impossible as far as the octopus was concerned. Even Kissinger was being difficult in bypassing normal circles of intelligence with Vietnamization and the China card. Since this was the mission that reaped a windfall, how did all the pieces come together for the snowballing of Watergate? What mistakes, though, were made? A different, marginally more officious costume was worn in Chile with Salvador Allende. Since this operation provided accumulated debt for favors performed, the octopus was now mature enough to know how to collect those debts. What were the favors performed, and what was the due bill? It didn't take many people to design the apparatus that would ensure the renewal of the lease for the Pine Gap installation near Alice Springs, Australia. After all, how could a democracy spit up a prime minister that could sack the security of the Western Alliance? What about tentacle operations of the octopus in Angola, Rhodesia, Mozambique, and Nigeria? Was this another case of wearing the right costume again, as in Chile? Politically correct assistance can cover the cover of the octopus for anything: drug trafficking throughout Asia and the Mideast, arms dealing, and murder. But what happened to the money? Nearly $1 billion. Who drove the Shah out of power? Can best friends do this to each other? What role did the octopus play, and for what reason? Who lit the fire for the war between Iran and Iraq? What part did the octopus play? What was its purpose in the big picture? Is any picture that big? Jimmy Carter had bruised the octopus as badly as Nixon did with Focus. Why did the octopus come off the ocean floor for this to make sure no rescue was possible? What happened to those Sea Stallion helicopters, the most dependable helicopter in aviation history? Ask Steve Bannon, I would say. Everyone knows that hostages equal money, but why is it that no one has asked what happened to the billions of dollars in frozen assets? Since Reagan was not a favored son of the octopus, why did it work so hard to ensure his election in 1980? Even if the participation by campaign officials in holding the hostages until the election was limited to just the acquiescence of smiling gentlemen who knew better, why was the veil removed when it could have been so absolutely secret? Exploiting foreign policy objectives with the Contras in Nicaragua is one thing. But why was the creation of a Latin American equivalent to the Golden Triangle so irresistible? A huge amount of money, several $1 billion, was raised for the Afghan freedom fighters. The freedom fighters didn't get it, and even the octopus had to fight for it. Who else started to play the game in earnest? How did the octopus stop it? Was it just a clever hand that the octopus played with Kuwait and Iraq? What about Kuwait's OPEC decisions, which goaded Saddam Hussein into his takeover? What roles did the octopus play? Why was the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, suddenly a sacrificial lamb? Before the reins of the octopus are turned over to several younger players, the game continues now, July 1991, on the tiny Caribbean island nation of Dominica. Possessing the largest boiling deepwater lake in the world, Dominica's geothermal potential is unmatched. It is here that the octopus may be making its boldest and most dangerous move yet. The Octopus is a story about 8 people who have been able to penetrate and exploit the secret empires of spy networks around the world, big oil, and organized crime. Since it spans the globe and in its compartmentalized penetration in such disparate secret societies has enabled it to control, through access, government around the world. This penetration by such a small group of people in such seemingly disparate and secret empires has enabled this group to develop compartmented tentacles that control governmental institutions in the US and abroad. Indeed, the octopus is less than a dozen people who have changed the course of history the world over. This completed project will rewrite history at the Bay of Pigs, in Allende's Chile, Watergate, Australia, Iran, Iraq, the 1980 election, the drug gun running in Latin America, and most recently, the war in Iraq. In events that span the globe, nations know how to use this octopus and acquiesce in its designs. I will show you how these 8 people caused the U.S. to turn its back on Fidel Castro after supporting him in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra. Well, no wonder this guy did not live to answer these questions for us. Chapter 14, Tracking the Octopus. Danny Casolaro believed the octopus responsible for criminal conspiracies which, linked, formed a virtual history of intelligence double dealing from 1950 to the present. These events, in Casolaro's view, including the ousters of U.S. President Richard Nixon, Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, the Shah of Iran, and the murders of Chilean President Allende and, of course, of President John F. Kennedy. Casolaro saw the octopus's tentacles entwined throughout the creation of the Golden Triangle and Latin American drug trade, the Cuban Bay of Pigs debacle, the October surprise, the BCCI banking scandal, and almost as an afterthought, the theft of Promise software. Casolaro found a, quote, secret team. That was that book by Prouty? Secret Team. I have it here. A high cabal of players operating a clandestine parallel government, identified previously by other writers. The cabal had operated beyond the control or scrutiny of the elected government, financed by drug running from Southeast Asia and the Americas. I look at the druggies on the street in my own family, dead, for example, but I see it, and I just see the richest society in human history has these human beings are garbage on the street. They're alive or dead. They are just garbage on the street. It's awful. And it's basically everywhere now. And I figured it was social engineering. It was a way for us all to feel like the middle class had to pay 50% of their taxes because poverty and mental illness and stuff are not conquered. And I think that those are part of the plan. But ultimately, so many times I feel like the underlying reason, if it can be, is money. People are like, well, they have all the money they need. They need the cash. They need to get the cash in the right hands. Yes, of course, you can own every vineyard in the world or every castle in the world, but you need to get cash in the hands of the people who conduct these operations or whom you have to pay off. And I feel like that's what drugs are. And think of the depravity to make that your product and have it illegal, so that can be really expensive, make you a lot of money so you can have a monopoly, and all of the pathologies that result from it being like a black market culture. Other researchers tended to see the octopus as a fog of political crimes ascribed to the alphabet soup of intelligence agencies, institutions, or even the natural dialectic of the modern terrorist state and its citizenry. Casolaro's octopus, however, was no grand, unified mega conspiracy theory. Casolaro believed the crimes could best be identified by linking them to a small network of named individuals that made up his octopus. He outlined their hierarchy and provided specific detail about their behind-the-scenes role in contemporary political history. Casolaro named people both familiar and unfamiliar to other researchers. He deemed the, quote, first-level operatives to be first level, Richard Helms, George Pender, John Philip Nichols, and Ray Klein. That's Cline. The second level included Robert Chazen, E. Howard Hunt, Edwin Wilson, Thomas Clines, Clines, and Ted Shackley. Working backward from the promised theft, Casolaro saw them in new relationship, a nearly organic entity that impacted on both past and then current events. So not a grand mega conspiracy, a unified mega conspiracy. I mean, worldwide coordination on COVID? I don't know. I mean, maybe things have changed. Casolaro's proposed chapter titles for The Octopus provide a glimpse into the trajectory of his research. These are his proposed ones. Chapter 1, 1980, The Most Dangerous Year. Casolaro's notes include subdivisions entitled, sorry, Peeve, it's titled, not entitled. You're entitled to something. You have a title in a book. Death of Paul Marasca, Death of Fred Alvarez, Resupply of Contras, Casey, Vesco, John Nichols, and Transition, Mideast. Chapter 2, Backing Up, The Post-War Years, 1944 to 1950, When They Met, Kim Philby. Chapter 3, Tag Team Compartments, 1959, Patrice Lumumba, Fidel Castro, Europe, Albania, Golden Triangle, China, Formosa, now known as Taiwan. He also brackets Moriarty, Marshall, Riconosciuto, Fat Tony. Chapter 4, 1966, Making Friends with the Terrorist Underground, Dealers, Drugs, and Money. Chapter 5, What Went Wrong with Nixon and the Windfall Surprise. Chapter 6, 1975, Australia with PM Houghton. Chapter 7, The Asian Underground. Chapter 8, Oil Controlling Countries. Chapter 9, The Big Crime, ICN, Yakuza, and Terrorists, Triads. Chapter 10, 1980. Chapter 11, The Role of Mossad. Chapter 12, KGB Underground. Chapter 13, Wackenhut. Chapter 14, Mideast, Beirut. Chapter 15, Iran, Shah, Helms. Chapter 16, Iran and Iraq. So as you read through these and you wish that he had written it and that you could read it, you got to think if anyone ever really can get away with writing the whole truth and getting it out there. Even as he sketched this outline, Casolaro continued making phone calls and connections that brought the octopus closer to the surface for a clearer view. Whether he approached his work as a student of history or as fodder for fiction, some of his realizations were not easy for him to face. According to Virginia McCullough, Danny would say that he couldn't believe the government would do drugs for arms. He was God, motherhood, and apple pie. I would say, look, Danny, let's get real. We're living in the 20th century. That's how I felt about 9/11. I thought they just wouldn't. And then I realized after Boston Marathon bombing, oh, yes, they would. And then the scales fell from my eyes. One new contact, William Turner, had been an aerospace engineer at Honeywell in Virginia until Hughes Aircraft bought his division. Turner, who lived a short distance from Casolaro, contacted him and furnished him with details of an alleged fraud by Hughes Aircraft. Turner claimed that when he reported the fraud to his seniors, they began a cover-up. Turner had left Hughes in April 1991. In August, Turner and Casolaro met in Martinsburg, and Turner handed over documents which he said proved a vast government conspiracy. Casolaro met with Turner again on February 21st at the Sheraton. The two discussed Casolaro's concept of the octopus, with Casolaro making further connections between Oliver North and BCCI. In May or June, they met again in Inwood, West Virginia, drinking and bar hopping. Casolaro was effusive over his book in progress and promised Turner he would personally autograph a copy for him once it was in print. McCullough at this time also noticed Casolaro's research taking on more focus and intensity. In the middle of May, he became very centered about what he wanted from me. What he wanted from me was everything I knew Reconasciuto was involved with the Iran-Contra, with the Cabazon Indian Reservation, and how that pertained to the Promise software. It began to come home to me, loud and clear, that there was real danger here. Chapter 15, Tentacles. This is a really long chapter. I will try to get through the whole thing, but we might have to cut it in half and continue after, but I will try. Chapter 15, Tentacles. The following material, labeled a hagiography in the original edition of this book, was assembled from Danny Casolaro's notes by researcher-writer Jim Keith. OG conspiracy researcher Jim Keith. My next book is going to be my favorite one of his. The following chronology lists some of the events and people that Casolaro believed involved the alleged super cabal, the octopus. It has been developed from Casolaro's notes, but expanded upon with additional research. Casolaro did not mention many of the internal connections documented here. Okay, so this is additional research by Jim Keith, and it has like a lot of subheadings. So we're going to go through one by one. OSS in China, the Albanian operation, coup d'etat in Guatemala. OSS in China. Casolaro's octopus may have begun earlier than he thought. That's what I was thinking. During World War II, the OSS chapter in China, Detachment 202, included in its membership's alleged octopi, Ray Klein, later station chief in nationalist China between 1958 to 1962, holy crap, E. Howard Hunt, holy crap again, and Richard Helms, as well as such future covert ops luminaries as Mitchell Orbell III, arms dealer, trainer of terrorists, and on and off employee of the CIA, and Major General John Singlaub. Singlab later commanded the CIA's infamous Operation Phoenix assassination program in Vietnam, which provided yet another link to other alleged Octopus personnel. I think Operation Phoenix was more than an assassination program. Look it up. China has historically had substantial involvement in opium production and trade, although it is not known whether the Octopus took much notice of the commodity at this time. In his notes, Casolaro lists Helms, Hunt, Shackley, Pender, Klein, Nichols as being OSS. The Albanian operation. The history of the Octopus, as delineated by Danny Casolaro, begins with the OSS British Intelligence Albanian operation, which took place after World War II. The Americans and British set upon a plan to try to dislodge a Soviet bloc country from Moscow's influence. Believing that this might lead to the shattering of the Soviet bloc, Albania was chosen because of its political instability and because of the belief that a large number of Albanian dissidents were waiting for the opportunity to revolt. According to the CIA's Frank Wisner, it was a clinical experiment to see whether larger rollback operations by the OSS would be feasible everywhere. I read about another test case, clinical experiment from, I think, the 80s, where they decided, or it must have been the 90s after the Berlin Wall fell, after the Soviet Union fell. They decided to see what would happen if they let a state fail, and they let Yemen fail. They said, well, there's no place else for them to go. I don't know what they did to facilitate that or what, and look where Yemen is now. Very nice. Using bases in Malta and Libya, Joint Commanders James McCarger and Kim Philby, the head of MI6 division in charge of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, liaising between British and American intelligence. Was he not the super spy, Kim Philby? Supervised, double agent traitor spy guy, I think. Supervised the landing of hundreds of agents into Albania via parachute or across the border of Greece. Almost all of these operatives were killed or captured. Kim Philby was an agent in the KGB's British Ring of Fire and was run by Yuri Molden, whose specialty was recruiting and wielding homosexual agents. Philby defected to Moscow and later admitted that he had betrayed the Albanian mission to Soviet intelligence. Wow, that's a lot of souls on your conscience. E. Howard Hunt played a subordinate role in the Albanian operation, working out of Washington, D.C. Although Danny Casolaro does not state it explicitly in his notes, he apparently conceived the Octopus starting as an anti-communist response to Philby's betrayal, a conclave of OSS CIA veterans dispersing and coalescing in what Casolaro called tag team compartments and reaping huge profits through assassination, arms sales, the control of governments, international drug trafficking, and the promotion of international fascism. Coup d'etat in Guatemala. The Octopus soon surfaced again. E. Howard Hunt played an important role in the 1954 overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz' communist-inclined but not communist government in Guatemala, which had been democratically elected. Arbenz made the mistake of appropriating 225,000 acres of land from the United Fruit Company, later renamed United Brands, an organization alleged to have been established by the mafia and deeply involved in international drug shipping since the early 1900s. John Foster Dulles and the State Department lined up behind United Fruit, which was not unusual since Dulles' law firm represented the company, and his brother Alan, at that time the director of the CIA, had earlier been the president of United Fruit. Kind of reminds you of Rumsfeld and Monsanto. Oh my gosh. Alan Dulles also shepherded an extensive post-war collaboration with the Nazis, most notably with Project Paperclip, in which hundreds of Nazi scientists and soldiers were brought to the United States. Alan Dulles served as the international lawyer for George Bush and on the Warren Commission, ostensibly investigating the death of John F. Kennedy, with whom he had super beef, major beef. Guatemala was prevented from buying arms from the US or its allies, forcing Arbenz to purchase arms from the Czechs, which in turn confirmed American suspicions that Guatemala had gone communist. The Guatemalan operation was part and parcel of the activities of the CIA in combating revolutionary activity and industrial nationalization in the Caribbean, Mexico, and Central America, later echoed in the CIA's attempts to invade Cuba and assassinate Cuban Premier Fidel Castro. The American invasion of Guatemala was assisted by the Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean, ACLC, a group started by ex-FBI, possibly CIA, Minutemen, and alleged Kennedy assassination conspirator Guy Bannister in the same year as the takeover. Lee Oswald purportedly knew Bannister, used his office, and was alleged by private detective Jack Martin to have been one of Bannister's agents. Bannister and Michael Riconosciuto's father, Marshall, have been connected to UFO activity, hoaxed or otherwise, in the Tacoma, Washington region. I remember that, yeah. That's in chapter 8 of this book. Significant in understanding the purpose and the reach of the Octopus is that the ACLC comprised a portion of what evolved into the World Anti-Communist League, with preparatory meetings beginning in 1958, although the group was not officially founded until 1966. Funding for the WACL was alleged to have been funneled through alleged Octopus member Ray Klein, who had been a member of the OSS in China and station chief for the CIA in Taiwan between 58 and 62. Researcher John Judge has stated that the WACL was financed by nationalist Chinese opium money. So, the nationalists were in Taiwan, FKA, Formosa. They were the government in exile after Mao took over China, and that is why they still consider themselves like the true Taiwan. And China itself says, no, that's over. But those would be the nationalists, I think. The chairman for the WACL was at one time Major General John Siglaub, linked closely and repeatedly to alleged Octopus personnel. The WACL has, over time, included in its membership Nazi SS, solidarists, mercenaries, death squad members, and other fascist elements. Ray Klein had also been influential in furthering the purposes of the international right wing in collaboration with Chiang Ching-kuo, the son of Chiang Kai-shek. In the late 1950s, they formed the Political Warfare Cadre Academy, with recruiting managed by the WACL. Again, the World Anti-Communist League. The Academy has been responsible for training many of the men involved in death squads, terrorism, and unconventional warfare throughout Latin America. Cuba. When Fidel Castro, who initially was anti-American but not communist, came to power in Cuba in 1959, he was rebuffed and diplomatically snubbed in his appeals for aid from the U.S. He nationalized the country's oil and gas resources and other industries, cutting American companies out when they had only begun to access Cuban resources. Castro also took over the lucrative mafia-owned casinos on the island, incurring the wrath of that group. It is hard to believe that guy survived. And there's not more to the story. President Eisenhower subsequently approved $13 million for a covert war against Castro, which included sabotage missions and at least 8 attempts on the Cuban leader's life by the CIA, following plans drafted by E. Howard Hunt, who is otherwise more successful in his assassination attempts, in my opinion. A possibly significant factor in the war against Cuba was that, prior to Castro's 1959 revolution, the island had been a major center for the mafia for heroin and cocaine processing and shipping from Marseille. A drying up of this important drug conduit greatly concerned the mafia and its long-term partner, the CIA, which had used the island's casinos to launder payments to mobsters. The OSS-CIA's partnership with the mafia had begun with Operation Underworld in 1936. CIA operations targeted against Cuba were run by Theodore Shackley and Thomas Clines out of the JM Wave CIA office in Miami, which grew into the largest CIA station in the world, employing over 3,000 agents and operating through at least 55 dummy corporations. According to a statement by E. Howard Hunt, Richard Nixon was the White House Secret Action Officer in charge of the 5312 group of the National Security Council, which ran the Bay of Pigs fiasco. The mafia supplied intelligence reports on Cuban troops and ships and recruited men for the CIA invasion force. Mafia Don Santos Trafficante, not his real name, later implicated by some researchers in the JFK assassination, worked through Frank Sturgis, aka Frank Fiorini, who engaged in pre-invasion raids and was a member of the Operation 40 hit squad to assassinate Cuban leaders. Richard Watley, a mercenary involved in this operation, stated of the Bay of Pigs operation that Trafficante would order Sturgis to move his men and he'd do it. Our ultimate conclusion was that Trafficante was our backer. He was our money man. Other members of assassination teams included Cubans Felix Rodriguez and Rafael Chichi Quintero and Mitchell Wurbel III, under the supervision of E. Howard Hunt, whose boss was Station Chief Theodore Shackley. Quintero appeared frequently in important covert operations, including as a Special Forces training advisor in Vietnam, doing jobs for the CIA's Task Force 157, and as supply officer for weapons shipments to the Contras, working with Shackley, Clines, Hakim, and Secord. Also alleged to have been involved in assassination attempts on Castro is Dr. John P. Nichols, the administrator in the Cabazon Wackenhut venture, which Danny Casolaro investigated. Edwin Wilson is said to have been a junior officer in the attempts to assassinate Castro and his supporters. The Bay of Pigs operation, in which 1,400 CIA-trained and armed anti-Castro Cubans invaded Cuba, was led by Theodore Shackley and took place on April 15th to the 19th, 1961. The operation was a miserable rout for the anti-Castro forces, and Kennedy was blamed by many of the involved JM Wave operatives for the defeat, for withdrawing logistical support. A sense of the importance ascribed to the Bay of Pigs operation is provided by E. Howard Hunt in his autobiography, Give Us This Day. Yikes. No event since the communization of China in 1949 has had such a profound effect on the United States and its allies as the defeat of the U.S.-trained Cuban Invasion Brigade at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. Out of that humiliation grew the Berlin Wall, the missile crisis, guerrilla warfare throughout Latin America and Africa, and our Dominican Republic intervention. Castro's beachhead triumph opened a bottomless Pandora's box of difficulties that affected not only the United States, but most of its allies in the free world. These bloody and subversive events would not have taken place had Castro been toppled. Instead of standing firm, our government pyramided crucially wrong decisions and allowed Cuban unit Brigade 2506 to be destroyed. The Kennedy administration yielded Castro all the excuse he needed to gain a tighter grip on the island of Jose Marti, then moved shamefacedly into the shadows and hoped the Cuban issue would simply melt away. Although not specifically named as a member of the Octopus by Casolaro, there is much to suggest that George H.W. Bush was part of the management of the Bay of Pigs invasion. This evidence includes the code name of the operation, Operation Zapata, reflecting the name of Bush's oil drilling company. At the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Bush had oil rigs located 30 miles north of Cuba near Khe Sal, an important CIA operations base. Former members of the CIA have alleged that Bush allowed the CIA to use Zapata as a front for its operations, and that Bush also functioned in dispersing CIA monies to agents in the area. I think his son, Jeb, did that as a banker in Venezuela, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken, but I think so. In Casolaro's notes, he makes the following connections. Zapata, 1953, narcotic smuggling, shadow government. There are other speculative links between Bush and Casolaro's Octopus, including the fact that the Bush family fortune was secured in large part through the rise of Hitler through his father's Union Banking Corporation, which acted as a front for the Nazis, specifically the major German financier Fritz Thyssen, Thyssen. To this day, George Bush retains many connections linked to the Nazis and fascists. George Bush is also a member of the Yale Skull and Bones Secret Society. Founded by General George Russell in the early 1800s, Skull and Bones has long been a recruiting ground for the CIA. General Russell was the Anglophile Boston Brahmin said to have dominated the opium trade in the 1800s as successor to the Perkins Opium Syndicate. Skull and Bones recruited from other Boston Brahmin families, such as the Bundys, Coffins, Paynes, Sloans, Tafts, and Whitneys, also alleged to have been involved in the opium markets with the Bush family, historically serving as operatives for these Eastern establishment interests. The current Russell Trust organization has also been connected to Wackenhut, another connection of George Bush to the Octopus. Stand by, hold on, about the Russell Trust. When I was looking into the Boston Marathon bombing, Tamerlan Tsarnaev's wife, Catherine Russell, her grandfather was a member of Skull and Bones, and I believe he was in the CIA or the OSS. And I always wondered, I mean, that's enough, but I always wondered if they were the Russells of the Russell Trust. I could never actually find it, but they were, I think they were from Boston. Another connection of George Bush to the Octopus is his acquaintance with George de Mohrenschildt. De Mohrenschildt apparently worked as an agent of the CIA, had Nazi connections, may also have been a Soviet agent, and events suggest may have been Lee Harvey Oswald's handler. According to one source, Bush's connection to de Mohrenschildt went back to the late 1940s. Bush's name and address were found in de Mohrenschildt's address book after the latter's death, which took place shortly before he was supposed to testify before the Warren Commission. The anonymous Com-12 briefing refers to the Black Rose organization, which runs a Black World Order using drug monies from the Golden Triangle and the Golden Crescent. According to this anonymous but intriguing report, the current chairman and co-founder of the Black Rose is alleged to be George Bush, known in underworld circles as the White Rose. Bush is alleged to have developed a heroin shipment ring while ambassador in China and to run cocaine from Panama through his offshore oil rigs. This is all George H.W. Bush. George, although I thought he was not Skull and Bones, only W was Skull and Bones, that like they skipped generations. Anyway, but it seems pretty clear this is strictly talking about H.W. Although not noted in this Samizdat document, Theodore Shackley, linked to drug trafficking in Southeast Asia, was the head of the CIA's Far East Division during the time that Bush was the American ambassador to China. When Bush became CIA director in 1976, he made Shackley Associate Deputy Director of Operations, the third most important position in the CIA. One anti-Castro group in Miami at the time of the Bay of Pigs was called the White Rose. The ultimate significance of the White Rose, perhaps leading back to the real power behind international drug running, may reside in George Bush's association with Boston Anglophile interests and his claimed connection to British royalty. The White Rose is the symbol of the House of York, which fought the War of the Roses against the House of Lancaster. Many researchers have noted British aristocratic and banking interests behind world drug trafficking. True. I have a book on my desk called The Dope. I don't know, but it's got a big British crown on it. An anonymous informant stated to Barbara Honegger that George Bush was elected an honorary, that is, non-Italian member of the Italian Masonic and CIA and Mafia and Vatican-supported cabal Propaganda Due, P2. This is pretty famous too, in 1976. His induction coincided with his appointment as director of the CIA. P2 is an influential secret society hardwired into major clandestine networks and known to have chapters around the world. The terrorism cell within P2, it was discovered by Italian police, was called the Rose of 20. I think that had something to do with the Gladio stuff. David Yallop, in his book, In God's Name, states that on the surface, P2 was and still is a fanatical insurance policy against potential communist governments. Excluding Italy, there are still branches functioning in Argentina, Venezuela, Paraguay, Bolivia, France, Portugal, and Nicaragua. Members are even active in Switzerland and the United States. Moreover, P2 interlocks with the mafia in Italy, Cuba, and the United States. It interlocks with a number of the military regimes of Latin America and with a variety of groups of neo-fascists. It also interlocks very closely with the CIA. It reaches right into the heart of the Vatican. Apparently, the common interest of all these elements is a hatred and fear of communism. Note the parallel with the anti-communist purpose of the octopus as viewed by Danny Casolaro. You know what's occurring to me right now? I've read things maybe discussed with you that socialism, that the CIA spread socialism in Latin America and got the Pope to okay it kind of along the way as an antidote to communism. They were afraid of communism, but they weren't afraid of socialism. They're not afraid of fascism. And you look at the Soviet Union and you think, well, communism doesn't work. You look at all those Eastern Bloc countries. And then the answer is, well, that wasn't really communism, right? This isn't really capitalism. That wasn't really fascism. But what this all is telling me, and I've read it before because I've read books on Gladio and the Vatican scandals and everything, and it really does always seem to say that they're totally terrified of communism. Now, it could be that like this WACL thing was an excuse for all sorts of operations in the name of anti-communism. But if they're really afraid of communism, it may be possible that there are forms of communism that really cannot, that they worry they could not control. And I wonder, so we just had an election in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez claims victory. No, Evo Morales claims victory. Hugo Chavez was the one who I think the West was really afraid of. Venezuela had the oil, whether he was, corrupt in some ways. I think of it like Gaddafi. Like they did redistribute some of the oil money to the poor, to the people, to the indigenous people. I mean, it's possible that there is a communism that, whether we would like it for ourselves or not, but would be incorruptible by these people, which is why they work so hard against it. But they're okay with socialism and fascism and stuff. Hey, just a thought. Kennedy assassination. After the Bay of Pigs, let's see if we're going to get through this. Yeah, we will. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, John F. Kennedy promised to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He did not carry out his threat, however, beyond dismissing Allen Dulles in July 1961, and his cohort, Charles Pierre Cabell, in December 1961. Richard Helms, as CIA Deputy Director of Plans, remained. Richard Helms also had the dubious distinction of suggesting to Allen Dulles the creation of the CIA's infamous MK-Ultra program in 1953. Helms became the director of the CIA in 1966. Shortly thereafter, at the time of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw, former CIA agent Victor Marchetti overheard Helms during staff meetings repeatedly ask an assistant, "Are we giving Shaw all the help we can?" Still on board at CIA after Kennedy's purge was E. Howard Hunt, an octo spook that Casolaro met on the phone. Hunt had helped set up the Bay of Pigs, was one of the Watergate plumbers, and was alleged by one Lee Harvey Oswald familiar to have involved him in a mind control operation. While Kennedy stated to aides, was alleged by one Lee Harvey Oswald familiar to have involved him in a mind control operation. Hold on. I should write a note. While Kennedy stated to aides that the CIA will have to be dealt with before traveling to Dallas, the opposite apparently came true. Persistent allegations placed Hunt and another Watergate burglar, Frank Sturgis, in Dallas on the day of the assassination. Some researchers have alleged that Sturgis and Hunt were two of the three hobos on the railroad tracks behind the grassy knoll who were arrested by Dallas police. Mark Lane, one of the earliest critics of the Warren Commission, documented Hunt's inability to defend himself in court against accusations of his presence in Dallas in his book, Plausible Denial. One of Lane's key witnesses in that trial, Merida Lawrence, named E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, Orlando Bosch, Lee Harvey Oswald, the Novo brothers, Jerry Patrick Hemming, and Pedro Diaz Lanz as part of a convoy that traveled from Miami to Dallas for the JFK hit. The Novos were later held for the Letelier murders. Bosch was imprisoned for bombing a Cuban Airlines jet in October 1976, killing 73 people. Were these more Octopus hits? And what of the George Bush address found in the address book of CIA agent George de Mohrenschildt, a close associate of Lee Harvey Oswald? De Mohrenschildt had been a spy for the OSS and German intelligence, and some have speculated that he also may have been Bush's CIA handler. Jean de Mohrenschildt alleged that her husband had been a Nazi spy. And J. Edgar Hoover had written a memo concerning Mr. George Bush of the CIA, who had been briefed on November 23rd, 1963, about the reaction to Kennedy's assassination by anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Miami. Bush had been briefed? J. Edgar Hoover had written a memo concerning Bush, who had been briefed on November 23rd about the reactions to Kennedy's assassination by anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Miami, briefed George Bush about the Kennedy assassination the next day. Bush, Helms, and Hunt held keys to answers behind the mother of all assassination conspiracy tales, as well as the strings to an octopus puppet who may have had special knowledge regarding JFK's death, Richard Nixon. The Watergate tapes of June 23rd, 1972 have Nixon and H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, scheming to put a halt to the FBI investigating Watergate because it might expose the Bay of Pigs thing. Later, Haldeman said that he believed that the Bay of Pigs phrase was code for JFK's assassination. Researcher Paul... does that provide a clue to one of the causal events? I actually think, I think it was E. Howard Hunt, or was it James Jesus Angleton, who said that the movie Executive Action was the closest to the truth about the JFK assassination. And I believe that that was tied into JFK's last speech, which was at American University, or the speech he gave before he died at American University. Very interesting. About a Pax, not a Pax Americana, but a peace for all time. Bush, Helms, and Hunt held keys to answers behind the mother of all assassination conspiracy tales, as well as the strings to an octopus puppet who may have had special knowledge regarding JFK's death, Richard Nixon. The Watergate tapes of June 23rd have Nixon and H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, scheming to put a halt to the FBI investigating Watergate because it might expose the Bay of Things. Later, Haldeman said that he believed that the Bay of Pigs phrase was code for JFK assassination. Okay. Sorry, I read that twice. Researcher Paul Congas points out that the tape reveals Nixon discussing the role of Bush's partner, Robert Mossbacher, as one of the Texas fundraisers for Nixon. On the tapes, Nixon keeps referring to the Cubans and the Texans. The Texans were Bush, Mossbacher, and Baker. This is another direct link between Bush and evidence linking Nixon and Bush to the Kennedy assassination. Wow. In the same discussion, Nixon links the Cubans, the Texans, Helms, Hunt, Bernard Barker, Robert Mossbacher, and the Bay of Pigs. Over and over on the Watergate tapes, these names come up around the discussion of the photos from Dallas that Nixon was trying to obtain when he ordered the CIA to burglarize the Watergate. What? Frank Sturgis told the San Francisco Chronicle that the reason we burglarized the Watergate was because Nixon was interested in stopping news leaking relating to the photos of our role in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Okay, so the official story of Watergate is that they broke in to DNC headquarters, but that never held water for me because Nixon was slated to, and even after the scandal broke, actually did win in a landslide. He would not have needed to do that, and he would have known he didn't need to do that. I read a book called Silent Coup about how Watergate was a coup against Nixon intentionally, and the book is great. It's definitely a limited hangout. And it says that the reason for the break-in was the DNC had some like porn sex thing or whatever, whores, I don't know what, going on at that hotel. And these guys wanted evidence of that. But again, why if they were winning? Why go dirty pool like that? You think these guys didn't have, I mean, how much long before this was like 10 years before the Franklin cover-up or less? No. Since that whole thing began. No, this makes way more sense because I knew the Nixon thing had something to do, or I had heard that had something to do with JFK, and maybe it's because he was himself implicated. I thought he was going to blow the whistle. Of course, he might have been pissed because JFK stole the election from him. He was Eisenhower's VP. They say it was like their disparate TV presence, but I think it's Kennedy stole the election. It's widely believed. Interesting. In 1976, it was revealed that Richard Helms had lied to the Warren Commission when he said that the CIA had not made contact with Lee Harvey Oswald. Freedom of Information Act documents showed otherwise. But George Bush used agency pressure through a call to Associated Press to prevent the story from surfacing. The career movements of alleged Octopus member Ted Shackley also illuminate Bush's secret life. From 1952 to 1959 and 1965 to 1966, Shackley worked in Germany. In the 62 to 64 period, he was station chief in Miami. Shackley became station chief in Saigon and Vientiane from 1964 to 1974 and chief of the CIA's Far East Division thereafter. Oh, it might be Vientiane. It's probably French. While George Bush served as the ambassador to China. After Bush's ascension to CIA director, Shackley was promoted to associate deputy director of operations, considered the agency's third most powerful job. Shackley was put in charge of Central American operations. Another nexus between Casolaro's research and the JFK assassination concerns the Banca del Lavoro, a state-owned Italian bank that he was investigating as part of the BCCI tentacle of the Octopus. According to the Torbit document, an unpublished report of some controversy among researchers, although there does not seem to be an indication that Casolaro had a copy, the Banca del Lavoro financed the training of an assassination team in Mexico, some of whose members wound up in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963. The bank's branch in Atlanta came under investigation for $5 billion in loans it made to Saddam Hussein prior to the Gulf War, the so-called Iraq-gate scandal with George Bush as at its center. Southeast Asia. The main sources of the heroin supply shipped to America since the 1930s were established through the actions of the U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly the OSS-CIA. Beginning in the mid-30s, through a collaboration with the Sicilian American Mafia and the Corsican underworld, the OSS helped create the French Connection in Marseille, France. The CIA in the early 1950s also supported the opium-growing Chinese nationalist Kuomintang in the Burmese Shan states. This was accomplished through two dummy corporations, Civil Air Transport, later named Air America, and Sea Supply Corporation, flying in weapons and cash and flying out raw opium. We had a little glitch there. Well, look, I have gone way, way over. So let's end the video here. I will start at the beginning of the last section, the section that got cut off next time. And I appreciate so much y'all coming. And I went over, so I'm going to hop, and let's hope that that wasn't too disruptive. Okay. Sorry for the abrupt ending, but has anybody else been having internet problems? I don't know. Honestly, honest to goodness, it started when um, I was doing all that deep web stuff with Gabriel Custodia. I'm an idiot. But since then, I have gotten a VPN, which could be part of the problem. No, you know what? It's not on this computer. So it's definitely not part of the problem. Anyway, okay. Thanks for coming. Until next time, this concludes part 5 of our reading of and discussion of the book, The Octopus, Secret Government, and the Death of Danny Casolaro. And if you want to listen to it without commercial interruptions, you can subscribe to a premium feed on iTunes on The Monica Perez Show.